Hello, and welcome to another Ethical Corporation by Reuters event webinar. My name is Dowd, and I'm the Managing Director at Ethical Corporation. Today's webinar is part of the recently launched Responsible Business webinar series. This is our fourth webinar now in the past 2 weeks, and we've had some really interesting and in-depth discussions, and we have a number of exciting webinars lined up for the coming weeks. So do visit our digital library within ethicalcorp.com/RBSNY. I believe one of my colleagues will be sending a link to all attendees now, which you can obviously click on. Firstly, I'd like to start today's discussion by wishing you all the very best. I know right now it's challenging and worrying times for many of us. So I'd like to take this opportunity to wish you all the best from myself and my colleagues at Reuters Events. I hope the best to you and your family in the coming weeks. As we navigate these challenging times, you may have seen that we at Ethical Corporation have somewhat pivoted our business. We are keen to keep the exchange of ideas, discussions, and networking, and you would have seen that we've been pursuing that through our digital platforms. And I'm pleased to say that we've had just over 800 signups for today's discussion, and currently looking at attendees, we're just shy of 200 attendees now listening live. And as billed, I have the pleasure of speaking to Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Senator Whitehouse and I were due to speak at this year's Responsible Business Summit in New York, but that now has unfortunately been postponed until later in this year. But both Senator Whitehouse and I were both keen to share some of the discussion points that we had planned to you, our audience. So hence us setting up this webinar. So we'll be touching on some of the key points we had planned, but also touch upon obviously some of the impact of COVID-19. In terms of the format for today's discussion, after my introduction, I'll hand over to Senator Whitehouse, and he'll spend 5-6 or so minutes setting the scene and I suppose getting the ideas flowing and kind of getting some, I suppose, discussion points for us to build upon later on in this webinar. We'll then have approximately 35 minutes to dive into some questions that firstly I have myself, but also some of the questions that you have. So please do look to the webinar pop-up box on the right-hand side, and you'll be able to submit your questions. And my team and I will look to try and get through as many of those in the next 45 minutes. Senator Whitehouse is the US Senator for Rhode Island and has been since 2007. Anyone that is familiar with his work, or like me, follows it on Twitter, you'll know that he's a fierce advocate for progressive values, where climate and inclusivity are front and center. Senator Whitehouse plays a key role in crafting policies addressing climate change, environmental protection, and carbon pricing, just to name a few. So it's quite, I suppose, apt, as we celebrated 50 years of the Earth Day yesterday, to have someone who's very much in our line of thinking and is definitely acting and trying to push the agenda that we need to deliver in the coming years. So there's a lot for us to dive into. But before I do, I'd just like to say good morning to you, Senator Whitehouse, and firstly ask, how are you? How's your team? And how are you adjusting to the lockdown?
Good morning, Liam, and good morning, everybody. We're doing fine. I've got family. My kids are both live in Philadelphia, but they are home here in Rhode Island for the duration with their significant others and their dogs. So we have a lively household, and the office is working very efficiently and effectively remotely and dealing with Rhode Island constituent concerns and trying to make sure that these big bills that we pass work for Rhode Island. And I think, considering the circumstances, morale is high.
That's good to hear. That's good to hear. And it's interesting to see the different pets and whatnot as people that have at home. So that gives us a bit of an insight into the people's personal lives. So, but it's good to hear you're well and your team as well. So yeah, I wanted to hand over to you as Bill. I'd love to kind of get you to open up the webinar. Share some of that message you were looking to deliver last month, and obviously maybe draw upon some other points that have come up since then, and then obviously that will set the scene for our discussion going forward.
Yeah, well, let me set the stage for our discussion by just going back through the time period that I've been in the Senate and what I have seen on climate change and climate legislation. I got there in 2007. I was sworn in, and through all of 2007 and through all of 2008 and through all of 2009, I was in the middle of a pretty robust bipartisan discussion about climate change. I think we had 4 separate bipartisan bills in the Senate, big ones that really would have taken on climate change. And if you want to add it as a 5th, we had Senator John McCain's presidential platform as the Republican nominee for president with a very solid climate piece in his platform. So as you looked around in those early years, what you saw was a Senate that was doing more or less what it should be doing with a big, hairy problem like climate change, which is working and struggling and offering legislation and having hearings and starting to get things done in a bipartisan fashion. Something changed very dramatically in January of 2010. In January of 2010, the 5 Republican appointees on the United States Supreme Court rendered a decision called Citizens United. And the hallmark holding of Citizens United is that you can spend unlimited amounts of money in politics. And Congress, the laws that had restricted congressional spending, particularly by corporate interests, were no good. So there was a sudden avalanche of money into politics, and it took the big spenders about 2 seconds to figure out how to hide it was them. So it wasn't just a flood of big money into politics, it was a flood of anonymous money into politics. The fossil fuel industry has a huge, huge stake here, and it very much wanted to stop these bipartisan conversations. So with this new political weaponry that it had from Citizens United, it didn't come after me, it didn't come after Barbara Boxer, it didn't come after Maria Cantwell, the Democrats, it went after Republicans. And in particular, it took a congressman named Bob Inglis from the Carolinas, who had a terrific, like 100% conservative voting record, but wanted to do something on climate. And they just cleaned him out in a primary and made an example of him for the rest of the Republican Party, that if you mess with us on climate, we will take you out. And a very powerful, what I would call dark money, anonymous money operation began in January of 2010. And literally from the day of the Citizens United decision forward, there has been no Republican in the Senate who's been willing to get on any kind of a serious climate bill. So we have had a lost decade politically, thanks to the power of the fossil fuel industry, pumped up by the Citizens United decision and its ability to act anonymously, to hide its hand. So the ad doesn't say Exxon, the ad doesn't say Marathon, it says, you know, Citizens for Peace and Puppies and Prosperity. And that, I think, has been a very dangerous and corrupted period for us. The good news is that we are starting to emerge from that. Republicans are tentatively starting to join in small pieces of climate legislation, seeing whether there'll be a blowback by this machine. The machine has been a little bit disabled, and for the first time, we're starting to see other corporate interests starting to stand up against it. For this decade, the machinery, the political machinery, the fake science machinery, the dark money machinery of the fossil fuel industry has gone without any competition, without any response, without any pushback from the rest of corporate America. And that is just beginning to change. So there's some cause for optimism that this lost decade can begin to be recovered.
Okay, thank you. And we're already starting to see some questions coming through. So thank you for that. And you know, it's obviously you talked to a lost decade there, and we've got what has been billed by many the decade of action ahead, and we need a decade of action. And you touched upon there, you know, the dark money that's blocking climate action. You know, some of the political forces that in the background that are, you know, preventing the ability to act. And you talk to corporate America there, and you're starting to see some action. A number, yeah, a large majority of our listeners will be, you know, senior brand practitioners. A number will be based in the States. You know, what can potentially they do? I don't know, you know, both now, but maybe more so in the coming months when they, I suppose, can start getting things in action. What would be your suggestions to them?
I would have 2 suggestions. One is to sit down with the people who do the lobbying for you and get an honest description of what is being said in your company's name by their lobbyists about climate change. I think most of them will find out that they're not saying anything about climate change, that these companies have signaled to their lobbyists that they have other priorities and that they're focusing on those other priorities, and they have not wanted to touch climate change because it puts them at odds with the fossil fuel industry, and they don't need that conflict. So I think what people will find is that their own corporate lobbying has been deathly silent in Congress about climate change. So that would be one. The second would be to go and look at your trade associations. The biggest trade association in America is the US Chamber of Commerce. Another big one is the National Association of Manufacturers. There's a lot of green commerce. There's a lot of renewable energy commerce. There's a lot of green and renewable energy manufacturing. So it came as a bit of a surprise, I think, to many people when the US Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers were identified by a group called Influence Map as being the two worst climate obstructors in America. And I think the reason that they became the two worst climate obstructors in America is that the fossil fuel industry flooded them with money. They won't report accurately where their money comes from, so you can't test this proposition. But if you are an American corporation and you're a member of a trade group, you ought to be darn sure that that trade group is actually following your policies and hasn't been co-opted by the fossil fuel industry and is quietly following the fossil fuel industry's policies, not yours.
Very interesting, yeah. And you touch upon the fossil fuel industry there, and we've actually, one of the questions has come through, and there's been a bit of debate around, obviously, the past week or two. There's been great fluctuations in the price of oil and gas, and obviously really bottoming out this week. And there's been some discussions of whether it will help or hurt the spread of solar, the renewable solar and wind. This person here, Joe Chaz, speaks to last time oil prices dropped like this, it actually undermined the growth of wind and solar. What's your thoughts, and is it concerns or optimism around that?
Well, I think one of the causes for optimism is that as we go into more of a sequestered personal lifestyle, we are burning less fossil fuel and we are less active. And the Earth, Pope Francis said the other day that most of the damage we're seeing is the Earth's response to our maltreatment. Isolating ourselves means less maltreatment, and we're seeing the Earth respond. We're seeing the pictures from India where cities that haven't seen the Himalayas in decades can now see the Himalayas because the air is clear enough again. We're seeing, kangaroos hopping through the streets of Adelaide, Australia, because it's quiet on the streets. We're seeing porpoises in the canals of Venice, where the fossil fuel powered motors used to churn up the canals. So there are these images of how the Earth wants to heal itself that I hope are positive images. And I think for the fossil fuel industry, when you're looking at a crisis, this is one, but it's been warned and warned and warned and warned again and again that the fossil fuel industry is headed for another crisis, the carbon bubble crisis. And so this might be a chance for them to have a bit of a wake-up call and begin seriously to start their transition to a clean energy economy instead of kind of truculently trying to bully their way through this.
So obviously, yeah, and you touch upon just then the kind of the impact of the lockdowns across the globe have had, and the kind of how we're seeing nature fight back, and kind of the cleaner airs and seeing wildlife in the cities again. And it's something I've noticed in my corner of southeast London. So you can hear the birds again in the mornings and evenings, but unfortunately, it's taken a very impactful and somewhat for some people disastrous situation where we've got this pandemic, and I think the predictions of the greenhouse gas emissions for this year will be around a 5% drop, they predict, but we need to see around 7.6%, I think they say. So that I suppose points to the kind of big transformation we need. We've had lockdown now for a couple of months, across different parts of the globe, and that's still not enough. So we need this is I suppose maybe indicated the type of transformation we need to see. And so,
although I would say this is the worst possible way to go about causing that transformation.
Yeah,
and nobody wants this to happen. Nobody relishes the fact that the coronavirus is rampaging through our species. There's a better way to do it, and that's a transition to renewable energy, which I think from almost every perspective will be better for jobs, better for technological advancement, better for the economy, better for everything than the status quo ante. Not now, but before coronavirus. We would have boosted our economy if we'd gone to this, but one sector would not have done as well, and that's the fossil fuel sector. And they've dedicated an enormous amount of their corporate effort into political manipulation. And so it's been very hard to work around their blockade, even though there are booming wind and solar industries, even in fossil fuel states, that can replace jobs and move revenues to domestic sources of power and clean sources of power away from foreign and dirty ones.
So, you talk to the I suppose the need to transform, and that's evident. And there's a couple of questions here that we've had in, and it's talking to the the financing and potential divestments from fossil fuels. And someone, and I apologize, I'm not privy to this, but someone mentions that in January you and other senators sent a letter to major US financiers, asking them to, I suppose, start being more active and more proactive in their and potentially divesting or calling for more action. This person's asked, what have you had any response from that letter? Well, firstly, if that letter did go, you maybe be able to speak more to that. And then, what kind of impact will that has as we start divesting from, what has been, I suppose, a steady investment portfolio for decades?
Well, usually, when we send these letters out, we get a response from the government relations person or the communications person, kind of politely saying that they take this seriously and blowing us off. But I do think it provides pressure, and I think you do gradually see behavior begin to improve. There has been a huge gap between the talk of the financial community and the behavior of the financial community. The talk of the financial community has been very, very strong on climate, and they have come up with all sorts of ESG measurements, and there is some talk of divestment. Some funds are divesting to various degrees from various things. But when push comes to shove, they really have not done a great deal. One of the worst behaved companies in America on climate legislation and climate activity is Marathon Petroleum, which is behind the attack on the fuel efficiency standards and is a big refiner, so it wants to continue to burn gasoline at full speed. They're very active manipulating the Republican Party to try to protect fossil fuel burning, and their four biggest shareholders are four of the biggest finance groups that take strong positions against climate change. So how is it possible that you can be a company that states your strong position to protect against climate change and then be one of the four top shareholders of one of the worst behaved fossil fuel companies and not connect those dots? And so I think the pressure that we've put on in these letters and in speeches and in other ways is helping to force the financial industry to connect the dots a little bit more and realize that it's not enough to have your comms people and your green energy people and your public relations people onto good climate message. You actually have to have your investment follow your stated principles.
Thank you. And I'm having a number of people actually come through. There's a whole raft of questions coming through, so I'm going to try and get through some of these as you're speaking to me. So you might see my eyes deviate away, but a number of people have thanked us for sending through that link of kind of that information you pulled together, you and your team have pulled together. So maybe for that.
Just say what the link is to a binder of various reports that my team has pulled together that relate to the crash risk of doing nothing about climate change, whether it's the Freddie Mac report on coastal property values crash or economic studies that show the meltdown from a carbon asset bubble bursting. It's a broad array of reports that are all quite authoritative and don't come out of, environmental organizations. They're, well, I guess Union of Concerned Scientists and others might be in there, but a lot of it is just hard economic analysis coming out of the economic and finance community, and the warnings are pretty damn severe.
We've just had and this is, I suppose, whilst we keep it on the fossil fuel industry at the moment, and we will jump onto some other topics through this discussion, but someone's, Francis Sherman sent for a question, European oil and gas majors have changed their position and appear to be leading the way to shift to a low carbon business model. From what you've seen, do you believe that? And is their CapEx budget reflecting this?
Yeah, I think that we're seeing real leadership out of the European oil companies. There's almost a direct correlation between how much business you do in America and how bad you are. The European companies tend to be leaning way forward, and even some of the European utility companies are actually saying that they're going to go to carbon zero, not just for their own internal operations, but for the power that they supply. And so you're seeing a much more forward-looking and forward-thinking European profile in the oil and gas and utility industry than they are in the US. I think the problem is that in the US, particularly after Citizens United, the crutch that the oil and gas industry has of political manipulation is less available to the European companies than it is to the American companies. And they've become so dependent on political manipulation as a business strategy that it's hard for them to give up that crutch and actually meet the coming demands of the economy and the planet. It's just such an easy thing to do, to fall back into that comfortable feather bed of sending your lobbyists and spending your money. They've put enormous amount of effort into building a whole apparatus to make that work so that it hides who they are. And that apparatus is still there. It's so easy to use. It's just a temptation that I think they can't help themselves from falling into. And if you look at their business model, according to the IMF, they need a subsidy of $600 billion a year in the US. That's what they get. And most of that subsidy is pollution that they don't have to pay for or clean up. It's the negative externalities of their business. But 600 billion with a B dollars per year is a very big number. And if you've got a liability like that out there, you're going to spend a lot of political money to protect that subsidy. And so I think that's what you've seen. That's why this political operation of the fossil fuel industry in the US has been so formidable. It's defending $600 billion a year. How much would you spend to defend $600 billion a year? And so that crutch is very appealing. It's one that they're very familiar with. And I think that explains the difference between the much more forward-looking stance of European oil and gas companies and utility companies.
And you mentioned there, and that, some lofty numbers. Sometimes I find it hard to fathom, that kind of money, and obviously I suppose the money that goes into.
That's an IMF number, by the way, International Monetary Fund. So anybody who wants to can look it up.
You talk there to the funding, I suppose, to keep that funding, keep that money coming. And I know, as part of some of the discussions we had prior, with yourself and your colleagues, something that you've highlighted both on the Hill, on Twitter, and in articles. A number of companies have been, spending vast sums of money to finance science denial over the past 2 to 3 decades. And whilst it's not unique to the US, there are a number of examples where bad decisions and policies have been influenced by this, this funding and this science denial. So, do you unfortunately, due to this pandemic, do you think we're actually starting to see some of the consequences of that, from that, I suppose, move to deny science and, I suppose, have a belief or opinion over fact?
Yeah, I mean, I think you see it with the anti-vaccine people. You see it with the reluctance of the Trump administration to accept the science of the emerging pandemic as it was coming at them. They saw it, it was reported to them, it came through the intelligence community, it came through their public health community, it was in the news. They had every reason and every piece of information they needed to act and prepare, but it was coming through scientific channels, not political channels, and they're accustomed to ignoring and tuning out scientific channels because the fossil fuel industry and other industries don't like those channels. So it's been, I think this is an object lesson in how very painful it can be when you ignore the science. The difference is with coronavirus, you're going to have the curve. We're doing our best to flatten that curve, but it is a curve, and at some point, a year from now, 2 years from now, 4 years from now, it's over. We have a vaccine, it's done. What we're doing to the planet does not have a backside to that curve in this century, probably not in this millennium. So we've got to be really careful about getting into too much trouble, because it's going to be very hard to get back out of trouble.
And you mentioned there, how do we, I suppose, move us back to a well-built on fact? I think it was only last night or the night before, the mayor of Las Vegas was actually on TV openly going against what scientific advice, and it's not unique. There's been case of this in Europe as well. So how, from your opinion or ideas on how can we move us back to a world and a case is built on fact?
Well, I think there are two things we need to do. One is we need to stop funding these phony science and climate denial and science denial operations. And it's not just the fossil fuel industry who fund it. Google funds a group called the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which is one of the top climate denial groups in America. It is out of the Competitive Enterprise Institute that the Trump EPA transition team came. There's a creepy character named Myron Ebell, who is a climate denying fake scientist who was the leader of the EPA transition team. That whole poisonous infiltration of EPA was done under the oversight of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Why would Google fund this? But Google does. We've caught them doing it. So, you know, every company should take a close look at who they're funding. And if they're climate denial operations and science denial operations, they ought to just knock it off. The other thing that we ought to do, and Congress ought to do this, I hope the House will begin to do this, because we can't in the Senate with, you know, we don't have majorities, so we don't have gavels, so we can't do subpoenas. But somebody ought to be subpoenaing these organizations, finding out where the heck they're funded. Because once you know who's paying for the science denial, then the story comes to the surface, and then people can understand, okay, I get it. This was a phony bought and paid for operation by people who had a huge stake in the science denial, as opposed to these groups standing out there with sort of, you know, theoretically neutral, benign names like Competitive Enterprise Institute and putting out stuff as if it were real. Once you see the whole story, then I think it changes public appreciation of it. So we really have to start to get into the dark money funding of a lot of these climate denial groups and show who is behind the mischief.
Yeah, and I would echo. My personal belief is, yeah, unfortunately in Europe we've seen, well, in the UK as well, we've seen a lot of kind of funding of groups and stuff with particular messages that we need to see that transparency of who's behind them and, you know, where that money is coming from.
That transparency isn't just a question of cleaning up the fossil fuel industry and cleaning up science denial, particularly in Europe. You look behind those groups and you see Russia. There is also a national security component to this. Russia and other countries are using our dependence on dark money to push their own messaging through and obscure their own hands. And in fact, David Petraeus and I wrote an article about that very phenomenon not too long ago. So there's real bipartisan concern about the national security aspect of this dark money problem.
So I find this intriguing, and I suppose I could dive into this for a long time, but I want to just shift gears maybe a little bit, and actually there's been a couple of questions coming through, maybe more on the positive nature and positive outlook, and what seems like a long time ago, when you know, the US and President Trump, you know, indicated US pulling out of the Paris Accord, we saw a positive mood of we are still in. And then, you know, the movement for the, you know, US corporations and, you know, some governors, mayors, cities and states, you know, pushing still with the, you know, behind the kind of the global effort. How impactful has that been? You know, you're someone who's probably seeing that, you know, behind the scene, or you're seeing different sides of it than maybe others. So how impactful has that been, and what can those, again, people listening in, what can they do to, I suppose, galvanize and help create greater action and movement going forward?
I think as a public relations pushback on where the Trump administration has tried to lead us, it's been very effective. I think on a company by company basis, some of the investments and commitments that have been made are very laudable. The problem that I see is that where I work in the United States Senate, nobody is still in. The lobbyists, the funding, the political persuasion, all of that is completely silent from the good guy corporations on climate change. A company may have a terrific policy about sustainability for itself and even for its supply chain, and then send lobbyists and engage with Congress in a way that completely ignores climate change. And most of them do. Forget the fossil fuel industry for a minute. Just take the good guy sector of corporate America. They are net negative against climate change legislation because they don't lobby for it. They're basically at zero in terms of taking any serious interest in getting anything done in Congress. And through their trade associations, the trade associations are sending the message, don't touch climate. This is not something where you'll be safe if you go there, political figures, don't touch this. So just the good guys between them and their trade associations are sending a strong negative message, don't do anything on climate change. Then you throw in the fossil fuel industry, whose apparatus remains staunchly adverse to any serious climate legislation. And you've got a situation in which a congressman or a senator looking around, looking for a friend to have their back if they might step out on climate legislation, doesn't see many friends, sees a very, very scary landscape of one side that doesn't care and another side that is still hunting for you if you cross them. And that's what needs to change. And it particularly needs to change on the Republican side, because the focus of the fossil fuel industry's suppression of this issue has been on the Republican Party.
I'm just looking for a couple of questions here, and we've had a number of questions around, some around the stimulus packages, stimulus package in the States, a few around obviously what's happening in Europe, and I might, I suppose, gravitate over to some of these questions. But I suppose as a segue, in the EU's Green Deal, that's been kind of reiterated as a kind of a center direction for Europe as we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. Someone's asked here, Thomas Smith, within the EU's Green Deal, there's specifically a border adjustment mechanism, basically which proposes a tax on goods coming from countries that do not have a carbon pricing implemented. Yep. How do you see the US responding?
So I think that the carbon pricing is the best key central tenet of any serious climate policy. It also has the additional advantage that it is the climate policy that over and over again Republicans have supported. Former Republican, chief economic advisors to presidents, former secretaries of the Treasury and others, Republican and libertarian think tanks and interest groups. Wherever you look on the Republican side for a climate strategy, you find a carbon price that is revenue neutral and border adjustable. So because that will work, why not say yes, go there and go the bipartisan way? This is another flag about how artificial the Republican science denial in Congress is. Because once you get outside of people who have to answer to money and to voters, there's not a lot of debate in the Republican circle about a revenue neutral, border adjustable carbon price being the right solution. It's only when you get to somebody who has to fund a campaign and sees the fossil fuel industry waving a giant club over their head and saying, if you dare to cross us, you will have an opponent, they will be well funded, we will cut you off, you are in serious trouble, we will go to your leadership, we will tell them that we are very angry with you and that we're going to influence the leadership funding we give if you don't get back in line. That is the problem that you have to face, but it's a very distinct endpoint with elected officials. Once you get beyond that into think tanks and former officials and Republican economists and so forth, suddenly there's a lot of bipartisanship again. So it's effective to do a carbon price. It'll make a difference to do a carbon price. It trades globally, so you can balance it and make sure you can expand it around the country around the globe more rapidly. There's a lot to like about it, but the other thing to like about it is that it's actually a pretty bipartisan theory once you get Republicans out from under the whip of the fossil fuel industry money.
And I've kind of pulled us over to this over to the green, the EU's Green Deal, and a couple of questions have come in, I suppose, relating to that in the sense that over the past couple of weeks, there's been a couple of key announcements from Europe around, where there was 180 CEOs, lawmakers, policymakers, committing to the Green Deal as part of the kind of rebuild of Europe, well, not of Europe as such, but as a centre component to the kind of direction of Europe as we go forward in the coming years. I think it was earlier this week, Denmark and Poland, if memory serves me correct, have said any company that has that is set up in a tax haven won't receive their compensation as part of their stimulus package. And we've had a few questions here relating to the stimulus package that is being rolled out across the US, and there's some questions around the concern that will be taking away potential finances that would have gone into the transition to a kind of clean, renewable, sustainable and inclusive economy. So my question to you though is my question to come in is to say, what are you seeing any evidence that there is going to be such kind of bold and progressive policy or stipulations or even further progressions that will give people hope, that give people that, you know what, even in the US, as part of this funding, they can expect to see a kick in the right direction, so to say?
Yeah. I think that our economic response to coronavirus has two phases. One is what I would call like a heart-lung machine. You have to take the economy and put it onto the machine while people figure out how to make money staying at home, while people, people still need money even if they can't go to work. So we have created that through massive unemployment spending, massive spending on companies that keep their employees on payroll, even if they're not bringing them into work. We are trying to make sure that money continues to flow to working Americans through this period while we flatten the curve and figure out how to get out of this. That's stage one. Stage two is going to be, I think, a big infrastructure spending effort, whether it's a single bill or multiple bills, to help bring people back to work, but also close some of the infrastructure deficit that we have in this country. We have rotten infrastructure in the US in a lot of places. And when we get to that infrastructure piece, I think you're going to see a very strong effort on climate sensitive, coastal, and other types of infrastructure that would be consistent with a Green New Deal. Indeed, in the Republican-led Environment Public Works Committee, the highway bill that we put through has a very big new provision for coastal infrastructure, because coastal infrastructure is at risk of sea level rise, storm surge, and the climate consequences in the ocean, and a huge new fund for electric vehicles, because electric vehicles are a coming thing, to build the infrastructure for electric vehicles. This out of a Republican-led committee, by and large chosen by Republican leadership to be as staunchly pro-fossil fuel industry as possible, so that the Environment Public Works Committee doesn't become a place in which, bad things happen for the fossil fuel industry. So if we can get bills like that out of the Environment Public Works Committee under Republican control, I think we can be optimistic when we get to the infrastructure phase of our economic rebuild, that there will be plenty of green infrastructure in that equation.
You just brought in a word there, and I've had a couple of people, and one actual comment come through just recently from a Justin Douglas, and you mentioned optimism, and there is hope amongst people that people will behave more sustainably and will think differently in the coming months and years. But as Justin said, he himself is not optimistic and not too sure how it may play out. And you mentioned optimism there. Are there, I suppose, any kind of points or messages you could provide to Justin and others here that sitting here and listening, thinking, I need a slice of optimism right now?
Well, in my little world in the US Senate, I am very optimistic for this reason. I saw bipartisanship happening around me on climate change. I saw an intervening force, the Citizens United decision, picked up by the fossil fuel industry and used to beat bipartisanship into the ground. I saw a lost decade, but now what I'm starting to see is that other industries are starting to see that they have a real stake in a clean carbon future. You see agriculture companies with a whole new point of view, a whole new recognition that climate change isn't just a communications problem, a shareholder management problem, a public relations problem for them. It's at the heart of their business plan. You're starting to see investment managers realize that if the carbon bubble bursts and if we have a lasting economic meltdown from the carbon problem, it's going to hurt them as badly as finance companies that did not have bad mortgages were hurt in the 2008 mortgage meltdown. So you've got agriculture, you've got finance, you've got investment management, you've got a lot of customer-facing companies that are starting to realize that this actually matters to them in a different way. And it's not just decorative. It's not just for public consumption. It actually is going to hurt their business. It actually might even imperil their business. And that, I think, is going to bring them off the benches and onto the playing field to push back against the fossil fuel industry. They have not been on the field for a decade. They have let the fossil fuel industry control all of the politics on climate change in Congress. Now that they see a real stake in their own businesses, I think you will see a very different approach beginning. You're seeing it with Climate Leadership Council, you're seeing it with Ceres, you're seeing it with some of these groups beginning to assemble. They're not there yet. They're still on the benches or at least on the sidelines, but you can kind of see them pulling on their jerseys and strapping on their helmets and starting to think about what getting on the field might look like, how they might plan this. And I think when that happens, they're bigger than the fossil fuel industry. If they wanted, they could go into Mitch McConnell tomorrow and say, hey, dude, we are done with you. We're not funding any Republican senators. We're not funding you. We're not funding any of your organizations. We are cutting you off until we get a serious carbon price. And that's just the way we're going to see this, because our livelihoods are here at stake. And if ag and finance, Wall Street, the big investment managers, the groups that are very, very impacted by coastal property value crash, community bankers and realtors and things like that, if they come in together with that voice, it'll be over, and we'll be legislating, and we can do a carbon price, and we can make it border adjustable, and it can propagate around the globe, and we can suppress the harm that we're causing and get back to resolving what Pope Francis called our maltreatment of the planet. It's as close as corporate America deciding to take this seriously in its political action in Congress. And that is becoming very, very close.
You mentioned a company series, well, an organization we work with, and yeah, they're doing some great stuff. So anyone listening not aware of their work, do suggest you're checking them out. And obviously some of the others you mentioned. We I suppose kicked off this well, it was not before, it was before this year. It was towards the back end of last year. We had an ambition for our written analysis, our events to really be around action. How can we talked about the theory, we've talked about the why and the what. It's all about we was talking about action. How can people act? How can companies act to make that change and to to start, I suppose, delivering that transformative change that we need to see? And we've actually had a number of comments coming through, thanking you, and and it's great to see your passion, and that passion is being kind of echoed or mirrored in some of these comments. And people are asking, how can they help get green into the infrastructure bill? What can they do to help persons like yourself and your colleagues and peers to really kind of, as you say, knock that door down, so to say, and get it front and center?
Well, we have spent about most of my adult life opening up the American political system to corporate influence and corporate power. And we can have a whole separate argument about whether that's a good idea or not. But the fact of the matter is that that's where we are right now. And corporate power outweighs public political power by quite a lot in the halls of Congress. Unless two things happen, unless there's a really strong public movement that people have to respond to. So thank you to all the young people who are out there forming that public movement, staying active, being lively, engaging in that. That really actually does make a difference. But for those in the corporate sector, it's really important to own your behavior. It ought not to be okay to be an American corporation that belongs to a trade association or a lobbying group that doesn't disclose where it gets its money. The Chamber of Commerce, for instance, won't disclose where it gets its money. And all of the corporations that are members of the US Chamber of Commerce are complicit in that silence by refusing to either release the information they're given about where the chamber gets its money, or demand that the chamber reveal where it gets its money. And that's how you end up with these situations in which the most powerful lobbying group in America, the US Chamber of Commerce, is representing on climate change only the discredited views of the most conflicted members that it has, because they don't disclose where their money is coming from. So they don't disclose that most of their money is actually coming from that small group, and that the rest of corporate America is being used to provide cover for a fossil fuel message that they don't actually believe in, that they don't support. Why would you trust an organization that took your good name and put it into the service of a very small fraction of the membership of the organization without telling you, all for gobs of money? You know, we can clean this up, but it's going to take transparency. People have to know what's going on out there, and then things become very self-correcting. So I think that a price on carbon and transparency around political funding will make a huge difference in getting this right. This is not a partisan problem. That's my closing big, like, what is my point today? This is not a partisan problem. This is old school political special interest, lobbying, political pressure, just dirty politics. And they've been able to hide it better because they've been able to hide their money flows through these front groups, and they've been able to co-opt the Republican Party by a combination of bullying and persuasion and money and make it look like it's partisan. But as soon as people see where the money is going, they will get what's really going on here, and this will self-correct very quickly. So for anybody in corporate America, why are you a member of any organization that isn't transparent about its funding? Why are you a member of any organization that is not actively pursuing a climate solution? And by the way, are your own lobbyists actually actively pursuing a climate solution or not? And I think what you'll find is that for virtually every company in America, the answer is, oops, how embarrassing. We're not. We all have something that's more important to us than climate. We all don't want to get hit the hot stove of perhaps getting the fossil fuel industry mad at us. So we're just going to ignore climate. We're going to lobby on other things. You fix those three conditions: transparency of trade association and front groups, not joining or supporting ones that are climate denial groups, and getting your own political act aligned with your own stated position. And then I think this weather clears up pretty quickly. So that's a real optimistic signal, I think. This was a man-made problem of political blockade and subterfuge, and you can undo that man-made blockade of political, man-made problem of political blockade and subterfuge.
That's very well summed up, and you kind of ticked off the points that I've been noting here as you've been speaking on some of the key points. You know, the transparency, the push for, the pressure that you need to do internally, externally. I'm conscious of time, and I know you've got a busy day ahead of you, so I'm conscious of that. And you've summed up very nicely there in a few minutes of the key points from this discussion. But I suppose we always call it the elevator pitch, the kind of last 60 seconds thoughts that you could leave people with, a compelling thought or soundbite that we could end this discussion on, to, I suppose, galvanize and give people that again, we've said it a few times, that optimism as we strive forward.
Well, I guess I'd say that we're seeing right now in coronavirus what happens when you ignore scientific signals. And there is a real price to be paid for that. We have been ignoring scientific signals, screaming scientific signals from the oceans, from the atmosphere, from the Arctic, from our forests, from pretty much every place on the planet about climate change. But we haven't been ignoring them because we're stupid. We haven't been ignoring them because they're not there, because they're false. We've been ignoring them because we've kind of exhausted ourselves trying to move politically against an industry that, because of this dark money spending that it's been able to do since 2010, has been able to suppress progress. If the rest of the corporate world stepped up and came into Congress and said, okay, folks, we are now serious about getting something done on climate change. No Republican, or for that matter, no Democrat, gets $1 from us until they are actively supporting a serious climate measure. And no leadership gets any money from us, Democrat or Republican, until they agree that they're going to bring a serious climate bill to the floor. We are cutting you all off. We are done with you. Then that drowns out the fossil fuel industry, particularly if you're undermining their intermediaries, the front groups that they've set up, by shutting them off, not giving them money, requiring them to be transparent about where they get their money, revealing them to be what they are, which is phony front groups, like, the Potemkin villages that were built for the Tsar when he traveled around Russia before the revolution, with fake peasants dancing in front of fake villages looking happy. That, I think, puts it into a context where our action, things that are well within our power to do, can turn this around rapidly. And when you turn it around rapidly, you then have a bipartisan result ready to go. You have very strong bipartisan support for a carbon price that is revenue neutral and border adjustable and can sweep around the planet so that we actually get the clean energy economy that we need.
Thank you. Very strong points there to end on. And yeah, I for one have felt enlivened and impassioned from this. So you know, I know we've gone over by 6 minutes, so thank you for extending the time on this discussion. And you know, I like to
thank you for having this discussion, and thank you for the trouble you took to reboot it after we could no longer do this in person and in New York.
Oh, it goes to my team. My team have done a great job, as of your team, to get this going. So I'd like to thank my team and your team for you know, setting this up, and also I'd like to thank you, Senator Whitehouse, for your time now and sharing your thoughts, but also for your impassioned work on the Hill. You know, we need that, and it's great to hear great to hear yourself and a number of your peers are pushing that message and that action. So thank you for that. And I'd also like to thank everyone for listening. It's been one of the most, I'd say, active in terms of questions, comments, and now a whole raft of thank yous coming through. So thank you for everyone for listening in, for being engaged. As I said, this is one of many webinars we have in the coming weeks, so do keep a lookout for them. And the team have been working hard, and we've got some exciting plans for later in this year to kind of facilitate more discussions like this, but maybe over half days, and you know, produce more reports and whatnot, because we need to keep that discussion going. We need to give people the ideas and the form of way of connecting and networking and meeting others that can help drive that action. So do look out for that. And until then, I'd like to wish you, Senator Whitehouse, all the very best in the coming weeks, and I'd like to wish that to all our listeners. Thank you for tuning in, and stay safe.
Everyone, stay safe.
Thank you.